All right, hello everyone. If you were here for the first panel, thank you for staying. And if you're here for the second one, thank you for coming. I'm going to introduce our panelists. I also just want to say our first panel was about what the world has recently been able to achieve at the global level through global negotiations, and that's a kind of governance framework for climate change that was agreed to in Paris in 2015. And in this panel, I hope to step back from that for a broader reflection on the history of the negotiations, but also to ask more specific questions about equity and justice, and what climate justice requires, and how we can reconcile that view of what climate justice requires with the political reality of climate change. So on this panel we have Kenneth Shockley, who holds the Holmes-Rolston III Chair in Environmental Ethics and Philosophy at Colorado State. And on Skype we have Maxine Burkett. Maxine is a professor of law in the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. We also have Don Brown. Don Brown is Scholar in Residence for Sustainability, Ethics, and Law at Widener's Environmental Law and Sustainability Center, and he's represented the EPA on U.S. delegations to the United Nations negotiations on climate change, biodiversity, and other sustainable development issues. And we're also very happy to be joined again by Sonja Klinsky. Sonja is the Senior Sustainability Scientist at the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability and an Assistant Professor at Arizona State University. So I know that many of the panelists also have experience at the level of the global negotiations, and many of these, actually I think all of these panelists perhaps were at the Paris negotiations. And so just to pick up the thread from the previous panel, I would ask sort of each person's thoughts, each panelist's thoughts on the Paris Agreement. Is it a success? Is it a concession to political reality? And sort of what their overall thoughts are. And I'll just go down the panel, starting with Ken.
Wow. So the question is whether it's a success or a concession to political reality, and I would say it's a success in that it's a concession to political reality. But I think what I'd like to point to is something, rather than reiterate what many people have said so far. I haven't been going to these the COP meetings as long as, say, Don has, or a few others in this group, but for about, I guess since Durban I've been going to them. And when I tried to describe what's happening in the dialectic associated with these conferences in sort of like a 50,000-foot perspective, especially to sort of students in introductory settings, and like you who have some experience, I like to provide this sort of really superficial framework, and it goes something like this. We started by thinking in terms of adaptation mitigation. You can go back to the Kennedy administration and look at that sort of balancing act, and how we thought about adaptation and dealing with climate change. There's a great history there. And as time went on, and we realized that it wasn't something you simply adapt your way out of, mitigation came back to the fore, and we ended up with this balance. How do we balance mitigation against adaptation? And then, in the more recent years, we developed what I argued should be, and I failed, to be a third track, that is loss and damage. And if you think of the overall arc, this looks like, well, first we'll just adapt our way out of it. And we're like, no, it's going to be worse than that. We've got to stop things. And then it's going to be even worse than that. We're going to wreck the world, right? And it looks just awful. And so the dialectic and the sort of the narrative arc of the negotiations over the last decade or three has this kind of depressing arc. But one thing that was really striking and sort of, I think, kind of beautiful that came from the Paris and the Marrakesh process, I need to find silver linings somewhere, the process was the change of the change of perspective that took place in the political space. And it sounds kind of abstract, but I'm a philosopher after all, so my job is to be a little bit abstract. That it no longer seemed to be about the interactions of disjointed parties engaged in sort of a Hobbesian wilderness, where we tried to figure out how to negotiate the best solution, let the rest of us figure out what came along. The space became vastly more complicated and more interesting. The space involved a number of other non-state actors. It included interested parties that weren't simply about the negotiators engaged in they were engaged in a combative relationship, and this is something that Andrew and a few others have mentioned in the last session. It seemed to be much more a space for people trying to get their minds around the kinds of problems we faced and how best we could resolve them given national interests. And that conditionality, given national interest, rather than that being the single modality of engagement, was, I thought, expressed by, in really non-technical way, the sheer mood of the conference. At this last conference in Marrakesh, people seemed to be much less engaged in small Kabbalistic reasoning in little corners of rooms. There was just, that used to be the way in which we thought of these conferences. You'd go up and you'd say, oh, who's hiding out in that corner? Literally. And now there wasn't as much hiding out, quite frankly. It was much more open. And for me, that's why I think it's a concession to political reality that this is a very big problem that will take multiple hands-on deaths, but also a positive step forward. This is the beginnings of a change in the political landscape, which eventually will lead into, I hope, a discussion of the changing face of justice in the international political realm.
Great. Maxine, would you like to share your thoughts on the Paris Agreement?
Sure. And first, I just want to say aloha from Hawaii. It's a nice way to start the day to join you. Thank you for allowing me to join you virtually. The Paris Agreement, I in terms of whether or not it's a success or failure, I often think about it with respect to where our expectations were. And given that our expectations with respect to the COP meetings had been sort of relatively low, given the track record over the past, say, 5 years, 6 years, it was a success. And that it was a surprise, and a welcome surprise that a number of very sticky issues were able to make some advance. It certainly is not sort of responding adequately to what we understand about the science of climate change, and that, obviously, with every update from climate scientists, the prognosis is grimmer, unfortunately. But what we know is, at least from the island perspective, is that it was a real breakthrough for sort of island voices in the negotiations. If you follow the arc that's just been mentioned, obviously there are power dynamics in the negotiations that are really difficult to shift in any meaningful way. But from the island perspective, there was an opportunity to go from being more of a silent, backgrounded voice with all of these sort of important and urgent proposals and mechanisms that would aid specifically their island geographies, but also obviously have a positive impact in broader geographies globally, right? If you save the islands, as Ambassador Jumeau from the Seychelles says, you save the earth, you save everyone. So instead of being an important backstop and coming up with great ideas that were getting no traction, and then moving into sort of a moral voice, especially I think peaking during the Copenhagen meetings, we saw in Paris that there was a sense of a breakthrough in the ability to shape the discussion and to have very important charismatic leaders be part of that discussion, pulling together high ambition coalitions, emphasizing the need for a much lower ceiling with respect to temperature increase, looking at funding mechanisms, which obviously are now uncertain, but having greater monies committed to islands. The meetings opened with the small island meeting leaders meeting with Obama, who declared he's an island boy as well from Hawaii, referencing being from Hawaii. So there was a real recognition, I think, of both the sort of the very real impacts that islanders are able to make in both the moral direction as well as the sort of practical direction of where the agreement was going. As far as some of the issues around loss and damage, which were obviously sticking points, we can talk more about it, I suppose, for the course of the panel, there were concessions, but each sort of major block had a red line. And for the islands, the inclusion of loss and damage was critical. And as well, certainly for a subset of islands, the inclusion of some kind of response to the issue of climate-induced migration was an important red line. And those were included in either the decision or the text itself. And whether or not it will have meaningful success over time is something that I think remains to be seen.
Great, thank you, Maxine. One of the topics I'd like to come back to is what you brought up about loss and damage and climate migration. So thank you for bringing that up. Don, your opening reflections on...
Yeah, I think something happened in the Paris Agreement is really, really big and no one's talking about it. And it's profoundly important. New York Times hasn't talked about it, we've covered Paris, and that is the warming limits that were agreed to changes everything about how you set a target. For 30 years, the way targets were set is you did a greenhouse gas inventory, you figured out what policies could reduce it, and then you deduced the number. Okay, but if you really have an obligation to limit the warming, everyone thought that was okay because you could tighten it up later on if you get on the verge of catastrophic warming. So everyone knew that you might have to tighten them up, but there was no practical need to it. With the 1.5 degree warming limit, and even the 2 degree warming limit, it changes everything about how you have to set a target if you're really committed to limiting warming to a certain amount. You have to think about how the target affects a carbon budget. I have colleagues all around the world, we believe that maybe the most important thing that we should be talking about is to get people to understand the practical implications of living within a carbon budget. Some of you here may know that the 1.5 degrees centigrade at current global emissions rate, we have 6 years left before the carbon budget goes to zero, okay? And the 2 degrees centigrade, according to UNEP, every time you say that this is out of date, because the carbon budget is shrinking every day. So it's not only the magnitude, but the speed of reductions. Almost all the environmental groups, even the most aggressive, aren't talking about the speed of reductions. Okay, the enormous discussion about the Clean Power Plan, almost none of it discussed about how inadequate it was in terms of living within a carbon budget. So what happened in Paris is earth-shaking. I think the most earth-shaking thing, and the number one thing that we should be educating citizens on, is the practical implications of living within a carbon budget. Every target is already implicitly a position on a carbon budget. Every target says it's okay for me to raise atmospheric concentrations by this number of tons. So targets are already a position on the carbon budget, but it was never made explicit, okay? Every target is already a position on a fair share. But it was never made explicit, okay? So the fact that a target is implicitly a position on a carbon budget quantitatively, and is already a position on equity, should give NGOs around the world a real concrete way to be critical of what countries have done. So I think the number one priority for me is to get Americans to understand how any target is a position on a carbon budget. The other thing that I think has been escaped by even the way the New York Times, Carol Davenport, is that emissions from the United States are killing people in other countries. Okay, it's not only, we don't only look at cost-benefit analysis. We have moral obligations to understand and explain in our target setting why it's okay for us to only look at U.S. economic interests. I've been involved in climate ethics for 25 years, and a lot of the academics are sort of off saying, well, we don't know what distributive justice requires, therefore we can't make progress. But that's the wrong way to think about it. Some claims of distributive justice would flunk any reasonable test of distributive justice. In fact, I was an author on the most recent IPCC chapter on equity, and IPCC says equity could only mean one of four things. It doesn't mean national economic self-interest. Okay, it can only mean per capita, historical, the right of developing countries to develop, and capacity, okay? So you have really good, strong ways of criticizing equity that doesn't depend upon you to solve what distributive justice requires. Following Sen, what we should be doing is helping people see that positions on equity flunk any reasonable articulation of what equity requires. And you can make really strong, non-controversial arguments that a country that only considers its own economic interests, that flunks any articulation of equity. When I was with the Clinton administration, and why this is so important is everyone is missing it. The New York Times is still missing it. There was a discussion of the social costs of carbon in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, completely missed the fact that we have duties and responsibilities to other people, that cost-benefit analysis is clearly morally flawed for this problem, to the extent that we give ourselves permission to kill other people because our costs are high, okay? So there are huge, obvious, strong criticisms of cost-benefit analysis that even people like Kenneth, who's an economist, acknowledge that you can't do this, okay? So one last thought is, if philosophers want to get traction, they have to become engaged in the ethical and moral problems with a narrow economic rationality for not only the US but other positions. There are strong criticisms of a very strong ethical criticisms that are available about a country for a problem like this that only considers its own self-interest as a way for justifying, but the criticisms aren't being made, and the philosophers aren't teaching people how to make these arguments. Our job should be, I think, to teach people the obvious moral problems with what's been going on. And the carbon budget now allows us to frame the issue in the way that these arguments should now be made, and that's a positive step in my view.
Okay, thank you. Sonja?
I feel like I already spoke to the Paris Agreement, so in the interest of keeping time for the audience, I'm going to skip this one.
Okay, very good. Good. Well, both Maxine and Don brought up questions about justice and questions about fairness, questions about ethics, and I'd like to focus on one way that you might think that climate change intersects with questions of justice, and that's with the idea of corrective justice. You're walking down the street, I'm driving my car, I lose control of the car, I hit you with my car, your tailbone is broken, you miss 2 weeks of work. I didn't intend to hurt you, but it happened, it was an accident, and it happened. But still, you can sue me, and the courts will force me to give you damages for your pain and suffering and for the loss of your time at work. Right? This basic conception that if you harm another person, you owe them some form of compensation, even if you didn't intend it, even if it was an accident. And so that is a kind of, again, this historic, basic concept of fairness or equity or justice that intersects with climate change, because it's the industrialized countries who have emitted historically most of the greenhouse gases, and climate change causes serious harms to some of the world's most vulnerable and poorest countries. And so there's a question of whether the industrialized countries owe compensation to those who are harmed because of climate change, just how I might owe you compensation even if I accidentally hit you with my car. So I'm wondering, and maybe we can go to Maxine, because I know that she's done, much of her work has been about working through and thinking through how this might work, how this might be justified, and then also to reflect on how that relates to what has actually been accomplished at the global level. So why don't we start with Maxine and then open up the discussion from there.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I have thought a bit about this, the disproportionate sort of source of the problem over time is pretty clear, and the United States is sort of, to quote, is sort of America first when it comes to obviously our degree of emissions and our sort of intransigence with respect to getting to a more sort of viable and equitable carbon budget, as Don had mentioned, and I appreciate Don's mention of that earlier. One addition I'd like to make to the way you sort of frame the corrective justice issue is that a lot of this can be understood as trying to make the injured person whole again, and so not forgetting that we could imagine another way to help to correct that harm and to make that person whole again, or make that country whole again in this case. And the insurance paradigm is one that you could think about as well, and in some ways what you see coming out of the policy propositions from islands as well is this notion that we could be looking at a sort of a global pool of funds that would help to make one whole again, and that pool would be contributed to based on a country's capacity to pay and historical emissions. And so there is a way to understand how we all are contributing to the problem, but of course it's such massively different rates over time, but can be sort of as a global community a part of the solution with respect to loss and damage in any event. We hosted a symposium on climate change, displacement, migration, relocation in December, and had the Foreign Minister, John Silk from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, speak to us. He sort of reminded us right at the beginning that it's quite amazing and insane, really, that we're having conferences about how other countries will be losing their territory and essentially displaced, with all of the cultural implications of that. And so when we talk about corrective justice, setting aside some of the mechanisms of it, what we are really faced with that is unparalleled, that's this no analog future, is the fact that these are situations that are almost impossible to imagine correcting in a just way. And so this also notions of rough justice, or the incompleteness of it, needs to be appreciated, which is that we can't, you can't restore, we at least yet haven't come up with a way to restore a culture and its connection with its territory. And in the Pacific in particular, there's an incredible amount of diversity. There's also an incredible amount of sort of roots and routes. In other words, there's been a lot of movement of culture across the vast Pacific, but the relationship to the land is really quite profound. And you have cultures and communities in which the word for the womb and the earth are exactly the same. So we're talking about a level of harm that, and a kind of harm that is quite unique in nature. So to some degree, I think the sort of tragic realization that corrective justice is also inadequate as a theory is really important, given the sort of the physical realities of what we're facing. And so it's a critical conversation that's difficult to have, even if we're dealing with the sort of the more straightforward. I have hit you with my my fossil fuel powered car, and you now need to be made whole again. We're sort of in an uncharted territory, and unfortunately, I think even the most well developed and well-meaning theories to address it are going to be suboptimal. We have to think differently about that.
So this is Sonja. Apparently this microphone is extra dodgy. Can people hear me? Thanks Maxine for that. I wanted to jump onto that. For the last year, I've been doing a project on trying to understand the extent to which we could use lessons from other profound, historical, messy justice conflicts in the climate space. So I've been bringing together practitioners and scholars who have worked on transitional justice with climate negotiators and advisors. Now, what is transitional justice? Transitional justice is one of these very incomplete forms of justice that Maxine was speaking about, where let's say you've had a genocide in a country, or you've had a dictatorship, or you've had a period of mass loss of human rights for a variety of reasons, and yet the country wants to hold together. They have to find some kind of a future, despite the fact that they have a completely broken past. Now let's look at the United States. Let's look at the long shadows that several hundred years of slavery have left this country. Or look at Canada, where you have an ongoing process of a truth and reconciliation process because of Canada's systematic well, originally genocide and effectively stealing native land and continued ongoing challenges for native peoples in our country. What over 60 countries have tried to have some form of transitional justice mechanisms where they've tried to say, look, there are some justices and some injustices which are so deep and so messy that we actually can't truly solve them. We can't make up for the loss of life. We can't make up for the loss of culture. We can't make up for the long, long damages that destruction of cultures does to each individual. But what we still have to find is some way of moving forward, that we can include people, that we can find ways of strengthening the societies that we have, recognizing that we're building it on this really difficult past. So for the past year, I've been running these workshops with as many variety of people as I can convince that this is not a completely crazy idea. And it started off really small, but I'm getting more and more people because people are realizing that we are, at some point, going to have to deal with this problem. And loss and damage brings up these kinds of injustices which can't simply be made to go away. And so I just wanted to add to that as this idea, one of the challenges of this is happening in a real political space. So I'm not a philosopher, nor am I a lawyer. I think the only one who's neither a lawyer or a philosopher. I'm a geographer, which is kind of a nothing in the best way. And one of the challenges in the political space is how do you get people to come together to discuss deep historical wrongs? Now just imagine your own lives. Imagine talking about slavery in your classrooms. Where do you stand? What does that make you feel, regardless of who you are in America, when you're having that discussion? Probably a lot of you get really uncomfortable for a variety of reasons. Now, dial this globally. When you're having these discussions about historical wrongs that are not easy to do right, we have to deal with how deep the sense on both sides, of all sides are, right? We are all implicated in this. And so one of the challenges there is creating spaces where people can both acknowledge, wow, I have benefited from a system which exists because it oppresses others. And that's a very hard thing to do, and that's exactly what we're asking developed countries to do publicly, globally, and in ways that would change their economics. At the same time, it's hard on the other side to say, wow, I'm willing to sort of say, okay, I'm willing to these agreements, and I know I can never truly get justice, but you know what? What you're giving me is enough that at least I'm feeling recognized and respected, and I know this isn't really fair, but I'll work with this. And this is this spot where it's really messy politics. And so this is why I've been doing this project. It's not just from a philosophical exercise, but to think deep inside at the individual and at the collective state level, what does it mean to be able to come up with some of these agreements that various people have tried, and let me say, often failed, to come up with some kind of a messy compromise that allows people to move forward. So this is some of the challenge of working in this corrective justice space, is that it gets right to the heart of comfort and uncomfort at the heart of what it means to be in the space.
That's great, and I didn't think it would be such a clean follow-on, but one of the things that strikes me about compensatory justice in the context for corrective justice, I like the word compensation for reasons that will probably be clear in a second, in the context of climate change, is because the harms are not as explicit or direct as we're used to dealing with in typical cases, or at least not typical, but paradigmatic or idealized cases of justice. So it is the case that we worry about the harms of rising seas and storms and whatnot, but of course we know that most of the challenges and problems formed by climate change are much more indirect. And a lot of them are diffuse in time as well. So I guess the simplest way to think about it, for me at least, is to worry about what exactly we're compensating for. Harm? But the harms themselves are very hard to characterize. They're not usually explicit harms, the sorts that are pain and suffering in a common way. Those are there too, and those should be addressed. And indeed, that this is part of the need for their addressing is part of why they were explicitly excluded from the Paris Agreement, and liability compensation isn't included in there. However, there is a provision, as we pointed out last time, that allows for that explicitly allows for the possibility of pursuing those avenues outside of the particular Paris process. hence the entree into insurance that Maxine was alluding to. But the notion of harm attached to this isn't just about explicit harm, it's about things that are compromised. Henry Shue pointed this out. It's the second form of harm if you followed his climate justice papers. That there's a harm that's caused to people by simply using up the budget that Don referred to a moment ago, right? That they no longer have opportunities available to them because the budget, the carbon budget that allows for, that prevents serious harm of other forms has been used up. And why this matters so much and why it ties back to Sonja's point is if you try to find some strange way to add up, to aggregate across some fabricated metric all of these harms, you'll exceed the total compensation capacity of the planet, probably several times over. And so it's time to start rethinking the notion of harm and what it means. Simple forms of compensation, the idea that we can make whole again in some semi-nostalgic fashion, that was probably never real to begin with, right? You can't undo the broken promise, right? You can just do the best you can to make up for it. In the same way, we have to think differently about the harms that are done through climate change and think differently about the forms of compensation. This isn't an excuse, it's not an excuse for those who cause the harm, the developed rich countries for the most part. But it is a call or a plea for negotiation over the nature of the harm and what's required. What does it mean to demonstrate respect for the people who have been harmed, for the countries and peoples and places that have been harmed? What does it mean to allow for some form of compensation, the capacity of cultural recovery or cultural names in the case of countries that are losing their place, right? And what does it mean to forego certain avenues of development that are no longer available because of the restricted carbon budget? So I guess one of the things that I focus on in the notion of compensatory justice is to simply ask what we're compensating for and what would it mean to deal with the harms for which we're compensating. For that notion of harm has become about as unclear as the notion of justice as we enter into a different kind of world. Yeah, go ahead.
I would like to talk about what I think is responsible for the incredibly poor state of talking about justice on these issues. And it's a problem, particularly in the United States. I had a research project, we got 26 researchers in 26 countries to figure out what was actually going on. And what we discovered on the first hand didn't surprise us. The INDC submitted before Paris, really what it was based upon was national economic self-interest, not justice, not a warming limit. That didn't surprise anybody. But what did surprise us was the complete failure of the NGOs in all 26 countries to effectively criticize what's wrong with simply looking at self-interest, okay? My experience is PhD students can't identify ethical and moral problems with neoclassical economic theory. What has happened is the disease we're fighting. If philosophers and justice people want to get traction, they have to help people see, that efficiency is, as a criteria for public policy, is really, really obnoxious for some human problems. Not for all human problems, but I'll give you one example. When I was with the Clinton administration, we fought over 2 cost-benefit analyses which should guide the U.S. policy. To this day, there's an executive order that requires the United States to whether it regulates or not, to do a cost-benefit analysis which looks at costs and benefits to the United States alone. Okay, so the Kyoto Protocol and subsequent cost-benefit analysis look at benefits and costs to the United States alone. It's not only efficiency, it flunks any moral test. The Pope just did this really wonderful encyclical based upon the idea shared by all the world's religions. We have a duty not to harm other people for our own interest. It's not controversial to make very, very strong claims that the way we're doing things flunks any moral test. In fact, I like to say a monkey would get what's wrong with the U.S. policy when it only looks in costs and benefits to itself alone when we're killing other people. So there's something amazingly underdeveloped in the criticism of the United States position. And now that we have the carbon budget, you have even more concrete ways of criticizing what the US is doing, because a target is in a position on a carbon budget. It's also a position on the US fair share. So I would argue that philosophers that want to get traction must dig into and help people understand what's wrong with self-interested efficiency as justification for climate change policy. It's a problem not only in the United States, it's a problem we know in Australia and Canada and several other countries. So what has happened, neoclassical economic theory has become the dominant discourse for all public policy. And it's okay for some problems, but some problems it's obviously wrong. And not only in terms of value, but procedural justice. It flunks a whole variety of justice tests. But the New York Times is not covering that. The New York Times is not covering what's wrong with the U.S. Position on climate change, where it only looks at its economic interests. So if philosophers want to get traction on climate change, they have to dig into and help people understand what's wrong with a neoclassical economic theory as a way of deciding U.S. policy, which only looks at U.S. interests. And the other thing philosophers should have been much more involved with, in my view, is what's wrong with the disinformation campaign, the scientific uncertainty campaign, why it's ethically completely unacceptable to argue that you have all uncertainty has to be resolved before you take action. There are strong moral claims that you can make against. If anyone is claiming that you don't have to do anything until all uncertainty is resolved, it's not only morally strong, it's legally strong. There's something called the no harm principle that says countries cannot wait till all the uncertainty is resolved. You have the precautionary principle in the climate change treaty. But what's so amazing to me is that there's little discussion about what's wrong with the scientific uncertainty arguments, both legally and philosophically.
Can I quickly weigh in here?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Something that Don mentioned was something that I thought a lot about a few years back, and this question of where we ask the cost-benefit analysis piece, where we make that determination, and sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not. It seems to me that there are clear instances where it's appropriate, and the problem is that we have the timing where we introduce that question is the issue. So Martha Nussbaum has a really excellent article called "The Cost of Tragedy: Some Moral Limits of the Cost-Benefit Analysis," and she wrote it in 2000, and she's talking about the tragic question, and it was really illuminating because it sort of suggests that there are two different questions at any given time. What should we do? And then once you make that determination about what to do, then there's the how to do it, right? And it seems to me that the cost-benefit analysis has always been about how to do it, what's the most effective way to do it. But whether or not to act, what we should do is a moral question, and moral philosophers, I think, are appropriately placed, and the questions they ask are appropriately placed at that point. And the cost-benefit analysis question, again, comes at figuring out which is the best way to effectuate the decisions that we've made. And unfortunately, we have, I think, the economic question that Don is highlighing occurring at that first stage, which is whether or not to do anything. Should we do anything? Do we act? And that's obviously, it seems to me, inappropriate, and I would assume, I think, consistent with what's been mentioned earlier.
Great. So I really like that the concept of rough justice has kind of come up in the discussion, and I kind of have a question about that. So let's say, so we need to keep warming below 2 degrees. That's kind of been an agreement in Paris, and that in a sense is a target that implicitly has a view about intergenerational justice, what we owe to future generations. Do we owe them a world of 2 degrees or a world of 1.5 degrees, right? Because climate change is such a long-term problem. So the question of the target, setting the target, is a question of intergenerational justice, but that, as Don says, creates a carbon budget that we now need to figure out what a fair sharing is amongst the countries. Who should cut how much? What's fair for them to cut? And so that's a question of distributive justice. Then there's a question of historic responsibility, corrective justice, and compensation or reparations. And my question for the panel is, there are these kind of overlapping questions of justice that are interacting with really serious feasibility constraints at the global level for global politics to achieve, kind of an action on climate change that meets those principles of justice. And so if we're in that kind of situation, I wonder what the panel thinks. How should we trade off achieving different principles of justice? If we can't make an ideal, perfect, just response to climate change, where should we put our energy to get the most justice bang for our buck?
Compromised opportunities. So it seems to me that if you need a single focal point, and I can't remember a time when I've answered a question with 2 words, but looking at ways in which particular opportunities have been compromised by people brings in some sort of historical index. It captures the Nussbaum perspective that was alluded to a moment ago. And it allows for us to worry about equity across a scale that's closer to measurable across different cultural differences, if I can put it that way. So I think that if there is a way to focus the intersectionality between distributive justice and compensatory justice, and even procedural justice, is to focus on what people are able to do and how they're able to flourish. That kind of capacity, that focus on how opportunities are available to people to live a life largely of their a life that they can recognize as their own, whether choosing or not, is certainly the focal point that I would have, at least, if you need some way of balancing those two.
Should I go along the panel, or does someone want to go next? Maxine, do you have a thought on the...
I'll defer to the other panelists on the specifics of weighing. I think this is a really difficult question. I would want to clarify, though, that it seems to me to be profoundly local. Maybe the geographer on the panel can speak to this as well. But Sonja, because there are different ways that we would negotiate those trade-offs in the Pacific, I think that would be more appropriate and fulfilling, if you will, and allow for the kind of flourishing that happens here. I would also just very quickly just remind everyone that the intergenerational piece also happens at a different stage based on geography. Here, it's not necessarily future generations that we're talking about that are going to be being impacted by the most unprecedented elements of climate change, like loss of territory. This is something that is forecast for as few as 1.5 to 2 generations, which many of us will see. People here, right here and now, and obviously it'll get worse over time, but we are looking at having to negotiate these trade-offs at a time scale that's much shorter. So just a quick amendment to that scenario.
I appreciate those points.
Yeah, I'm going to be controversial and provocative. I don't think much turns on future generations in this problem. Obviously, it's an important consideration for a lot of ethical theories, but the reason why 1.5 degrees centigrade was chosen is because there's evidence that some of the things that we didn't think we would trigger, the nonlinear responses, we're starting to see them. Okay, we're on the verge. The reason why the whole world, including the Saudis, agreed to 1.5 degrees centigrade is everyone agreed that 2 degrees centigrade's probably not strong enough to prevent rapid nonlinear responses. Last year, UNEP claimed there were 400,000 people that they could attribute current people to climate change issues. The future generations problem, which is important, and the only where it's relevant is in the discount rate for cost-benefit analysis that I see, but you really don't need to go to, it's not that future generations are unimportant, you don't need to go there to be morally appalled by someone says, I'm going to look at my economic interests and the rest of the world be damned. Future generations doesn't add anything to the moral opprobrium that you can clearly and strongly make about what is wrong with self-interested economic theory, which ignores the responsibilities to not harm others. The most basic moral principle is I have a duty to treat other human beings with respect. So what I am intrigued by is how poor the ethical discussion about all this is. I think even philosophers get sometimes tricked by the economic arguments, but ignoring the clear moral responsibility. That self-interest alone is not an adequate moral justification for national policy. And why isn't that better understood? I don't understand.
So I don't think this is going to be a totally satisfactory answer to your exact question, Corey, but this idea of trading off between forms of justice, to me, we're so kind of woefully behind achieving any of these forms of justice that trading off between them, I don't think we're there yet. And as a non-philosopher, I feel very comfortable saying it's not my job to come up with an ideal theory of justice here. This is not my job. And over time, when I first started working on climate justice as part of my doctoral work. And I ended up with it by accident. I had been asked to do a project on climate adaptation in a very, very wealthy neighborhood. And I was like, wait a minute, you want me to spend 4 years of my life trying to help the richest people in Canada? Wait a minute. And so I threatened to drop out of graduate school. And someone said, what you're really interested in is justice. You should work on that. I said, whoa, you can do a PhD on climate change and justice? Like, this was a novel thought. I didn't even know philosophy really existed. So I'm coming at this from a funny angle. When I started, I was full of these very like, oh, I'm going to come up with the perfect, I was reading all these early work, some of Don's work, I was reading Henry Hsu's work, and then all these other people started coming up with all these formulas for how we were going to come up with a just global allocation, right? I was like, oh, this is totally exciting. And I was like, whoa. Went to my first COP. It was Copenhagen. Not a good place to start. And realized I had totally missed the politics. Right? It's politics. This is a political situation at the local level, at the national level, at the international level. And I'm not going to say that justice doesn't matter. I think it does. But I think for me, the most important role that justice brings in this space is to open up our assumptions about the feasible and the desirable. And this comes a little bit to Don's point here is I worked for 2 years in a department. I was the only non-economist in a department of economists. And ideas about what is feasible or not feasible are actually assumptions based on what will people accept without any actual evidence, or assumptions about how fast can society change, also without any evidence, or what is an acceptable cost, also no evidence, right? So these are feats of imagination, and we make them every day. And so where I think ideas of justice is, I'm not so concerned about pinning down exact frames of justice and trading off this one for that one. Where I'm interested in the role of philosophy and where I think it's so powerful is it reminds us to use our moral imaginations. We're humans. We have this capacity. We have a capacity to ask ourselves, what is desirable and why do I desire it? And am I being completely selfish here? Or am I actually reflecting some deeper thought? Or am I just doing this because it serves my own need? And I think trying to encourage this incredibly hard, it's really hard to do at the individual level, much less at the national level, even more difficult at the international level. But for me, this is why this question about justice is so important, because we need to question our very ideas about what is feasible, what is desirable. Desirable for who? Feasible for who? Who's going to benefit? Who's not? And so for me, I'm totally ducking your question, but that's my roundabout way of saying I don't think it's the right question.
I'd just like to reflect upon IPCC for a minute. IPCC Working Group 3 was completely controlled by neoclassical economists for the first 4 assessments. There's a new book on climate sociology, which I would highly recommend, that has a whole chapter is that how could it be that IPCC was controlled by economists all this time, when these justice issues, which were mentioned in the IPCC reports but sort of dismissed. And why is there no sociology which explains how power works? Okay, and I was asked to be a lead author in the IPCC report by someone who was inside the 5th assessment who called me up from Brazil, and she said, Don, I need your help. The economists are driving me crazy. Okay? They want to make all justice into efficiency. I keep bringing up these justice issues, and they want to say, no, that's efficiency. Okay? So there's something really remarkable about how these obvious justice issues have become understood narrowly through the lens of usually not heterodox economists, but neoclassical economic theory. And again, if philosophers want to make a difference, your job is to help people understand what's wrong with that, because most people they don't know what's wrong with using efficiency as a substitute for justice or distributive justice. I had a grant from Duke, a $50,000 grant to test students at Penn State whether they could see the ethics and justice questions in cost-benefit analysis. And this is in fact the case. The graduate students were worse than the undergraduate students. Okay? They had been taught that everything is a factual, empirical question. Justice doesn't count. They've never had thought to think about it. So, in my view, that's the very top of the challenges, is to help people around the world see what's wrong with a narrow neoclassical economic theory as a prescriptive tool. It's not that economists can't give us important information. We need their insight about a lot of things. But the idea that you simply decide on public policy based upon efficiency, regardless of how the harms and benefits are distributed, or who caused the harm, who's affected, a monkey would get what's wrong with that from an ethical and moral standpoint. Yet graduate students don't seem to get that, it seems to me.
All right, great. I'll take this moment then to make a shameless plug for my environmental ethics class. If you want to think more about the relationship between justice and efficiency on environmental issues, take my environmental ethics class next fall. Right now we have about 20 minutes left, so I think it's probably a good idea to open it up for questions to the audience. I'm sure you have lots of thoughts and questions that will keep this really great discussion going.
Hi, my name is Gabby. I'm a second-year law student at, can you hear me? Okay, got it, yeah. I should not have judged other people for not being able to do this. So my question is, and this ties a little back into thinking about when we perform a cost-benefit analysis and when we make the decision of when we do that. But moving into the more justice-oriented context, when do you ask the question of when do we move from identifying an issue to identifying solutions to that issue? And then how does that relate to the question that we frequently see as a frame of what's the corrective justice, what's the distributive justice, what's the procedural justice framework that we need? Is that in and of itself already bringing us into too narrow of a framework for a discussion? Do we need to start bigger than that at looking at, should our perspective be one of ideal justice or a non-ideal justice where we're already living in an unjust world, and allowing those to then inform our ideas of the more specific, broken down versions of justice?
Sure. I think we're already, one of the almost presuppositions of this panel is that we're already living in a very, very non-ideal world. And that there's a very limited role for ideal conceptions of justice. So determining how best to apply some notion of justice, whether we call it that or call it fairness or call it compensation or however we want to characterize it, is certainly part of the problem characterization. I think, I'm not sure if this gets quite to your question, but I think we're in the realm of what's now public parlance of wicked problems. Like, we shouldn't ever presume that any characterization of problem will come along with a solution, and that any solution we have itself is going to generate new problems. So we can assume that this is going to be an ongoing adaptive strategy, and that there isn't going to be any simple fix to any given and characterized problem. So how we go about framing these, the concerns we have regarding climate change, I think we have to be very contextual about whether it's a specific problem or a general problem. And this speaks to Maxine's point earlier about how we consider the nature of the challenges that are posed to different communities and different environments by climate change. I'm not sure how much that directly answered your question, but it's contextual. We're already in deeply non-ideal situations, and the application of cost-benefit analysis is at best a tool to be used in certain limited contexts.
Sure.
The question about where, when do we move from identifying the problem to the solution? My answer there is, we need to just get on with this already. I mean, we are so behind that just like, you know, the powers that be purposefully misled the American public to ask this question about, well, is climate change real? And even now we hear people saying, well, we don't really know how much of climate change is due to humanity, and until we know we have more certainty, we're not going to act. Humans are very susceptible to this form of corruption. We will allow ourselves to sit on the fence for a very long time until we are absolutely sure, by which day it's way too late. So this idea of ought we to identify the problem before we start working on solutions, how many of you have ever said, oh yeah, I know that this term paper I have coming up, I have it in my head, I'm going to sit down the last minute, write it, it's going to be great, right? And then you write the first paragraph and you go, I have no idea what I'm talking about. And none of my arguments make any sense, and you're pulling your hair out. You learn by doing. You don't know how to do this until you're already doing it. So the last thing we need right now is to say, well, let's make it perfect in our plan. What we really need to do is start getting our feet and bodies and hands and minds and hearts fully in the work, because only then will we have a better understanding of really what the problem is and how we're going to solve it. This isn't something we can plan in our heads and implement with our hands.
Maxine?
Maxine, go ahead, Maxine.
Yeah, just to quickly chime in, I agree with the urgency and speed of that notion that we need to move ahead. I think this is the importance of the academy stepping up, right? We have the time and the sort of the job description to think about these things. So I think they can happen simultaneously so that we're not just acting without thinking about the consequences. My concern is that when we act, we want, and we act with speed, that we want to make sure that we're not just creating other states of affairs that are unjust over time. And so it's really important that as we're pulling together the solution sets, that we have a space for reflection that engages with the doers in the ways that a number of the panelists do, but I think the Academy generally could do more of, so that we do have reasoned, thoughtful, and sort of solutions that have thought about the consequences of those solutions themselves, because what we put into place oftentimes ends up being part of the problem, and much like the car replacing the horse and the issues that come from that. I would also say that when we talk about what humans do and when we think about our moral frameworks, especially being here in the Middle Pacific, there are a number of different frameworks that are existing, that are philosophical frameworks that are existing, but are perhaps unconventional. And so just to introduce one quick quibble with sort of the notion of the Anthropocene that I've had for a while too, is that there are a number of ways that humans organize themselves, and we made a set of decisions, some subset of us made a set of decisions that have gotten us here. And that, sort of the continued use of cost-benefit analysis and neoclassical economic liberalism has gotten us here in a way that I think philosophies that are based in the Pacific may have gotten us to different places. And so I just want to be careful to make sure that we understand that there's a cultural dynamic here, that some of the solutions are not just stuck in the academy, but are stuck in other philosophies that aren't as recognized in the sort of formal discourse, and that also needs to be forwarded as we're acting.
I think it's a mistake to try to figure out what distributive justice requires, because reasonable people can really disagree. There are 5 or 6 frameworks that have been proffered. They all have adherents. A number of philosophers have said the reason why justice has not taken off is because it's a hard problem. This distributive justice is a hard problem. Both Dale Jamieson and Stephen Gardner, that was the central part of their work, completely ignoring the fact that, as Sen says, you don't have to know what justice requires to make strong statements about injustice. Okay, what philosophers should be doing is spending less time, in my view, on what theoretical justice requires and helping people see what's unjust about the system. There's surprisingly, and I don't know why academic philosophers they seem to be shying away from saying publicly, the U.S. claim that it can look at its own economic interests flunks any ethical or justice theory. It's just not part of the conversation, but it should be, in my view, the central part of the conversation. Okay, so the way to proceed, and the way that I think the The hope for the Paris Agreement is that the transparency mechanisms will help people make strong arguments about positions that flunk any justice theory in this space.
Hi, you hear me? Thank you for today. Today's been great. I have a question. I know we talked a lot about the economic self-interest, and I'm kind of wondering about the role of security self-interest in this dialogue. So our political climate today, for whatever reason, it's centralized on fear a lot, and the nationalism that kind of comes with that. So I'm wondering, because with climate injustice comes, food shortages, climate refugees, and social instability in general. So would framing the conversation for justice as a security interest be an effective way in today's dialogue to push climate justice further along? Or kind of like what Don says, should we try to get away from the whole idea of self-interest in general and focus on the broader global problem?
I can.
Go ahead.
I just want to say something real quick. I never said you don't talk about self-interest. What I said, that's not the only thing you talk about, okay? It's not that you don't make self-interest in arguments, but you need to make justice arguments too that go beyond self-interest.
Right, I see.
Yeah, I would just say that I face this question every day when thinking about the climate-induced migration question, because security is another default way to understand what we're talking about in terms of migration, because we are very committed to, the sort of the firmness of national borders and all of the transactional issues that happen in that space. And the problem is we try to resist that as much as possible because we don't want it to be framed in a way that the appropriate response mechanisms include all the larger apparatus of national security, right? It becomes an issue of national borders and military, and do we talk to PACOM or are we talking to USAID? I mean, there's even the players that are involved, depending on how you frame it, will determine how it's treated and how those that are on the move are treated. And so to me, there's a spectrum. They could be treated as a threat, which I think the security framing does, or they could be treated as those that have suffered as a result of our actions, and in which case there is more of a human rights response, and that apparatus comes in. And the middle is something like, oh, isn't it too bad that these folks are losing their land? We can use a more humanitarian response, but that becomes a charity framing. So there's a spectrum of how you frame this as an issue. I think this, I do think self-interest generally is not helpful and doesn't necessarily get us to the right answer most of the time. But security, again, is a question of, do I talk to PACOM, Pacific Command, or do we talk to our colleagues in the human rights world and think about how we solve this problem? And I'm very nervous, in fact, about the fact that we can't talk about climate change in a sophisticated manner. We certainly can't talk about justice in a sophisticated manner. And we've never been able to talk about migration and immigration in a sophisticated manner. So when you marry all of these issues and then bring security in, it seems to me you're talking about a very dystopic future, which frankly is probably the biggest argument for acting now I can find, because the alternative is just pretty bleak. And that's my concern.
Sonja?
One quick thing is, I remember in the middle of the George W. Bush years, going to a conference and realizing that the people from the government who were talking about climate change were from the defense community. And I had a really good colleague of mine who does research on how to build mobile solar panels. Couldn't find funding anywhere. She's a Quaker, deeply pacifist, and was offered a huge amount of money to do this from the American Army. And it put her in a really awkward situation, because here she is, she's Quaker, she's pacifist. She's convinced that the research she's working on would have huge implications for development of renewable energies that would be mobile, off-grid, accessible, easy to transport, lightweight, all these things that we want for massive scale-up of renewables funded through the military. And so I'm just pointing out that there's the military defense framing can be, it's definitely it's complicated on so many levels. It's complicated for exactly the reasons Maxine pointed out. But it's also complicated because they're an increasingly powerful part of our government who control an enormous amount of money. And some of their interests align with some of these other interests. And so it makes it a very tricky space. So I don't have an answer. I myself, as a pacifist, I'm also very uncomfortable in this space. But more and more of my colleagues who I'm speaking with are coming from military backgrounds and are deeply involved in these issues like renewables, partly because the military themselves are seeing the cost to themselves because of things like how many people get killed because of having to have oil transport. So it's a very messy issue. I don't see an easy way out of it, but I just wanted to bring that up to you.
All right, great question for discussion. Does someone else have?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Actually, let me chime in quick on the last question. I think that for a long time, one of the things we focused on in terms of trying to promote action domestically in the United States was that two of the strangest partners, the strangest bedfellows with the environmental movement turned out to be the insurance industry and the Department of Defense. Simply because they had research programs and vested interest in looking at the long-term effects of climate change, right? You don't have a long-term property management scheme in South Florida if you don't have some sort of insurance program. So it turned out that they were convenient for mobilization. But notice that the framing rapidly turns into a framing of isolation, separation, and fear. And that is a dangerous framing to structure your long-term strategies that require us to move beyond localized domestic issues, as Don has pointed to, and to move beyond simple economic catastrophe framings, also something that Don has implicitly framed. So I think while there is a domestic use for mobilizing action and trying to force the more pragmatic, recalcitrant elements of American political environments to move, it's a very dangerous toy to play with in terms of mobilizing and understanding the dangers of climate change. Destabilization is about destabilizing human lives as much as it's about destabilizing national boundaries. So that's my sense.
Hi, thanks everyone. I don't know, I kind of have a question that also dates back to the previous panel as well, and I'll just try to frame it as succinctly as I can. I guess my question, again, it's trying to step back and think more broadly and address these questions about framing and the context in which these questions were raised. And I guess I'll just frame it like this. How can we talk about even the very possibility, or maybe the impossibility of achieving climate justice as we've already been framing it in terms of this non-ideal framework, but how can we be having these conversations if without, I guess, fully addressing or putting it into conversation or in context with what I think, and I think it's important to acknowledge as the root of the crisis itself, without a perspective on or a conception of what the crisis is and what generates it. And this is where, again, I want to frame the conversation and ask maybe to reflect on, you know, how can thinking about climate change as a structural crisis of capitalist civilization put these questions of climate justice in sharper perspective? Because again, it seems to me, to the extent that we're having this conversation about, again, designing institutions or designing mechanisms for allocating responsibility and resources and such, that fails to address what I think many people, not just critical intellectuals, but social movements themselves are mobilizing and demanding in the streets. Again, regarding what I think they're identifying as the structural contradictions of the system in which we live. How can we even, I don't know, I guess I just want to challenge the kind of a lot of the implicit assumptions that this conversation seems to be proceeding along. Is it possible to even have these conversations about climate justice without addressing this as a more deeper systemic structural crisis of the system we live in?
I'll start with Maxine.
Maxine, start.
Well, yeah, thank you for that. I think this is, I've just actually kind of wrapped up an article on called Climate Disobedience, and I'm looking at the question of nonviolent civil disobedience and the tendency for the current climate movement to sort of harken back to other great movements like abolitionism and civil rights, and seeing if that is an appropriate sort of point of comparison and where it succeeds and fails. And I think a lot of the issue that you find and what you're addressing is this Because there seems to be sort of a vacuum at the middle, right? An important space where we don't really know what it is, what that world is that we're asking for. Well, what are we looking for? What is the problem here? And how do we? What is the sort of the gravity that pulls it all together? The moral gravity that pulls it all together. I think that's what I'm hearing from your question. And I've tended to find that what we're really grappling with here, and whether it's capitalism or other forms of political economy, is really this sort of the excess and waste and inequality that is untended in these processes. And so a lot of what we're finding also in the environmental law literature harkens back to indigenous approaches to worldviews and indigenous approaches to management. And I think what we're looking for in terms of what is the alternative that we're sort of fighting towards, or we're using all of these justice tools to move us to inch us closer to, are really around notions of connectedness and humility and seventh generation, to borrow a quick term, and the notion that there are consequences. And you're seeing more of that in the environmental law literature. The notion of adaptive management is harkening back to that. And I think having a sort of clearly laid out vision helps us to frame what's not happening well now, where the issues are, where we're failing to create a sort of a vision for a better future. And again, just to sort of tie back to where I started, these weren't as big of an issue for other movements because the end point was really clear. Let's end slavery. Let's ensure equal rights, sort of similar footing for African Americans first in the civil rights movement, but everyone that was suffering from this sort of differential treatment. We had a sense of what the alternative looked like. In this case, in terms of climate change, we know the alternative is fewer parts per million, but that's not an ethical framework. That's how do you put ethics onto that sort of very stark scientific and clinical approach to it? And what we're looking for is a different paradigm. And I think you can find that in different cultural inputs that I see playing out here in the Pacific and even in Hawaii as sort of this interesting experiment of multiple cultures creating a different kind of legal ecosystem that is, I think, aspirational still, but successful and certainly has some important lessons to share.
So I have never been a negotiator, and there are many times in my life where I have felt that this is a huge loss, that I'm not inside, I don't know what's really going on, I can't talk to hard politics, I'm not an economist, I can't talk to hard numbers. But what that has allowed me to do is every time I go to negotiations, I go to civil society. There's civil society and then there's civil society. So there's the inside of the inside, there's the outsiders who go to inside, and then there's the outsiders. And the great thing about being an observer is you can go hang out with the outsiders of the outsiders. Now, that happened in Copenhagen. There was an entirely alternative people's forum. It happened in Durban. There was an amazing, amazing forum held by the largely Marxist KwaZulu-Natal University. And I'll never forget sitting outside in a tent in a parking lot of the African Women's Agricultural Congress, or Rural African Women Congress, where they had literally taken a bus across Africa and picked up women in villages all over the place and shipped them to Durban. And they weren't allowed in negotiations, but they held their own Congress in little plastic chairs in a tent in the parking lot. And they were talking about a huge gamut of things and really radical shifts to society. And then I went into the negotiations, and I went into this room, and it was an invitation-only side event, very fancy hotel, china on the ceiling, little cut-up cookies. You had every single what are these things called, like folder things, was in a leather container. And the guy in the front, and women had all been talking about agriculture, right? These are women who are responsible for feeding their families. Agriculture is a really big deal. And the guy in the front of the room was this young, white, European guy who was maybe 23, curly blonde hair, said, agriculture in Africa is dead. We need large industry, we need to transform this economy, we don't need to be thinking agriculture. And I was like, whoa, 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 like, dude, I was just in this amazing meeting with all these people, but they're on the outside. And so I keep seeing this in the climate conversation. There have been all these really broad conversations. Now, the problem is, how do you bring that in? And at the same time, let's think of what happened in America in this last year, where we've had massive increase of conversation about inequality across. Like, you cannot find an American, I don't think, right now, who has not, at some point in the last 8 months, had to think about how much inequality is in America? And I think that these provide really terrifying but potentially useful opportunities to start having some better conversations and more productive conversations about the kind of country, kind of load we want to have. And it can either go, wow, we don't want to do this, it's too hard, let's just have a authoritarian rule because it's a lot easier. Or we can have, how do we actually bring in these voices and have a much messier but much more inclusive conversation. I know there's been a lot of frustration within those who have tended to focus on good governance because those messier conversations aren't as governable. They're harder to bring into the conversation. And they throw off our dependence on how we do government. And those rules about how we do government are really important. More than ever, I'm appreciating all the norms that until this administrations have abided by. They really matter. But at the same time, there's this opportunity to tap into a larger conversation. And I have no idea how to do it. My only solace is this is a very interesting time to be alive in. This isn't very helpful, but these conversations is not the first time these conversations from the part of what has been excluded are coming in. I think it's really useful that they're coming in, but I have no idea how to do it in a productive way. That's your job.
I think we have a really, you can find excitement in tragedy. I think this is a very exciting time to watch the international political landscape shift. And it is changing dramatically, whether we like it or not. And I'm hopeful, at least, that this provides the kind of avenue for just the sort of exploration you're asking for. Like what has led to this god-awful mess, right? And that's, I guess, my hope is that we'll find in the efforts to find solutions and the need to find more inclusive voices, ways of finding alternative solutions. I think there's corners of that happening now, but it needs to be more explicit and more transparent. And I can only hope that that'll happen in the future.
All right, unfortunately we're out of time, so I'm sorry if you had a burning question. You're welcome to come up and speak to the panelists now, but let's thank them for their time.